Welcome. Let's talk about the pelvis and the hips. Most people, when they put their hands on their hips, in fact, are putting their hands onto their pelvis. So let's have a little look at this geometry here and this beautiful piece of architecture so that we know what we're talking about. This is the pelvis, and there's different parts of the pelvis, and these are the hip joints. Okay? Now we're going to start with the hip joints and talk a little bit about what the characteristics of the hip joints are. A lot of people will experience pain and discomfort in these areas, and they can have bursitis, they can have inflamed or arthritic hips, and there's a whole sequence of other hip dysfunctions that can permeate through a person's movement patterns that are, interestingly enough, always contributed to by how this sits into its joint. Now, this is a ball and socket joint, and it's very important to understand that you have got a ball and a socket, but they don't touch, or at least they should not touch, in a functional body, okay? And the reason being is that you have a series of ligaments that go all the way around this. And the idea of these ligaments, a little bit like this model here is that all the parts that are there are designed to hold this object together, but also hold it apart. So the ligaments that encase this area here hold this joint together, but also hold it apart. Now, why is that important? If you have a highly mobile joint, like the hip joint, it is supposed to be able to go in all sorts of directions, but repetitively. If you have a joint that's touching, that's friction, and that's going to cause a lot of problems in the form of heat and wear and tear. And the cartilage, a lot of people think is a bit like enamel. It's not like enamel. Cartilage is much softer. It is not up to the idea of the friction. At very best, it can occasionally dampen an impact in the area, but it's certainly not designed to be a sliding articulated surface. So, if the ligaments and the pelvic position and the hip position are in their appropriate functional position, this will be floating in that area, held together by this beautiful arrangement of ligaments. Now, if there's a deviation to that structure, if you find yourself in a situation whereby, let's say for instance, there's a problem with the foot or a problem with the knee, and this turns one way or the other, you can end up with contact in this area, and that can create the heat friction I mentioned and start to give you arthritic hips and the likes. But of course, around all of this, you also have the muscular structure, which attaches many muscles across this joint. And those muscles have tendons, which become part of that joint-like structure too, in some instances where they will cross over in and around it. But of course, if there is an unnecessary movement pattern there or an excessive movement pattern there, those muscles will also create heat and friction through overuse. And the bursae, little fluid-filled sacs that sit in around the structure, can become inflamed also. Now, I point all this out by helping you to understand that a joint like this, in its full functioning position, will last a lifetime. And if you found yourself in a situation whereby this is giving you trouble, well, more than likely, it is not in the right position. Now, what are the other factors that can create a malalignment in this position? Well, we mentioned the pelvis. Your pelvis, as you can see, should be sitting more or less straight across, okay? And your pelvis is supposed to move as part of your walking action. Now, the movement at this sacroiliac joint is infinitesimally small, but it exists. The movement really happens at the hip joint, but also in the spine. And that works in conjunction with the rest of your body. So much so that the movements that are occurring here can be measured in parts of the head. And equally so, the movements that are measured here in this sacrum, okay, that becomes the tailbone, can also be measured in the head. So it's very important that if you have a pelvis that is to have full functionality, that you have to have a full functioning head position at the other end, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But for now, what we need to understand is that this pelvis is also heavily ligamented. And that's a good thing because it also holds the pelvis together, but also allows it to articulate slightly inside of the movement that has to happen. Now, we are also aware that the organs that exist inside of this area, of which there are many, okay? In females, you'll have the bladder sitting here, and you will have a uterus behind it, and you will have then, of course, the rectum, the ovary configuration, and some of the intestines. It's a lot of stuff to get into that particular space. But if you have a deviation in how this pelvis sits, let's just say it's tilting to one side. Well, it does a couple of things. It takes the ligamentous structure that not only holds the pelvis in its position, but also the organs inside. And they deviate, they can move, they can start to favor different directions. So that can create problems insofar as bladder issues, bladder incontinence. You can also have prolapsing of the actual organs themselves. You can have compression onto the ovaries. You can have compression onto the actual rectal area, creating constipations, as well as the intestines above it. But the bottom line is that if you change any one of the ligaments that are in there, of which there are many, liken this to a basket. If you pull one strand of the basket, the whole basket changes shape. And this is similarly affected, okay? Because every single part of the body is aware of what every other part of the body is doing at all times. So in this particular configuration, if you move one of the ligaments, not only will you distort the pelvis, but that is going to have an effect up and have an effect down. Now that is not exclusive to the pelvis. Every part of the body can have an effect up and an effect down, and often will be measured, significantly so. And in this situation where you have a pelvis, let's say, that has deviated off to one side, well, what will happen is the leg will turn a little bit on this side, the leg will turn a little bit on this side, the organs inside get affected, and just because you have a pelvic tilt, you now have got two hips that are under pressure, the knees and the feet below them, you've got organs inside that are not sitting where they're supposed to sit, and that of course then affects the sacroiliac joint. And that's just with a side tip. Now, how could that possibly happen? Well, let's consider if you're at a desk and you've got a mouse and you drop into your mouse position. You've now moved onto one of your hip bones, okay? You're pressing down, and then through your hip bone, you're pressing down into your bum bone, your ischium. If you do that enough, that becomes your pattern. That becomes essentially how your body reads your position. So when you return to the stand, you can carry into that shape, and you bring that to your walk, and you bring it to your driving position, and it starts to actually become an established dysfunctional pattern that you've habitually formulated. It can happen in the car when you're driving, if you have one hand up leaning in, or perhaps you lean on the center console. All of these things have got considerations, and that's before you consider some of the sports that you could be doing that could be one-sided. What if you're a tennis player, badminton player, squash player? What if you're playing pool or snooker and you're leaning over the table the same way every time? What if you're a hurler or a golfer? There's so many sports that are done on one side. And of course, we've got to make sacrifices to enjoy the sports that we play, but we've got to understand there can be a cost in doing something on one side and not on the other. Would you consider going to a gym, for instance, and just doing one side and not doing the other side? Well, of course you wouldn't, but this is what you're doing in everyday life. Think about when you approach a set of stairs and you bring this pelvis to the set of stairs. You'll take the first step every single time with the same foot. Now count the steps and see if they're even or uneven. And if they're uneven, and they often are, it means you're going to get so many steps on the right and so many steps on the left, and they won't balance. And how often are you doing that? These are the things to consider, okay? But this pelvis configuration not only can tilt from one side to the other in either direction, it can also tilt from front to back. And we see this a lot. The pelvis rotates forward. That increases the lordosis curve, but puts extra pressure onto the sacroiliac. So you can actually have a forward tilting pelvis and a side bend. Now that's going to have an effect at sacroiliac level, but it's also going to deviate the spine. And that can deviate in different ways depending upon whether you're forward or back, and depending on whether the left or right side comes up. The fact is, it's a deviation that's beyond where you're supposed to be. So what happens then is that deviation is carried all the way through, right up. Because if this is scooping, you will usually see an exaggeration of this curve here going the opposite direction, and then this scoops back at the top, which means you end up with this configuration. Okay, how often have you seen that? How often have you seen the slouch creeping into people's behaviors? Okay, so essentially, where this deviates, this starts to fall. It can work in reverse, but we'll talk about that when we're talking about the spine and we're talking about the head a little bit later. But the upshot is that if you are not looking after your pelvic position in therapy and then with exercise after the fact, you are creating dysfunctions that can lead to all of the issues that we hear about when we talk about back. From sacroiliac issues, from the issues that come from the pinching or the compression of the spinal nerves, whether we're talking about sciatica, whether we're talking about iliolumbar ligament issues, whether we're talking about the inflammation and the entrapment of nerves as they leave the spine, whether we're looking at the arthritic formulations of the hips, any of it, all of it will be associated with a structure that's designed to last you for life, that is deviated out of position. So it's fundamental for you to understand that if you have a side bend or a tilt, you've got a responsibility to do something about it so that you can bring yourself into a position that the inflammation and the destruction that's being caused by that inefficient position can be waylaid, so that you can start to make a real recovery. Because injecting these areas and offering operations, although the surgery is wonderful and the injections are effective, if you leave the shape that caused the problem in the first place still in place, well then of course your problem will often come back. So your duty of care is to bring your body into balance and account for the fact that this has got to move. This has got to support a spine. This has got to house all those wonderful organs. And if there's any structural variation in this, or you are not associated with it, you will have dysfunction affiliated with that. And that's the pelvis and the hips. And that's that.